Morning all. Let's continue our look at some key World Championship candidates games played recently in 2014. And I thought I should mention on the chessworld.net videos menu, if you go to video search on the videos menu, once you register and log in, you'll see options like playing the annotated version of the PGN, and that's very useful alongside this video, especially if you have more than one monitor, so you can play through on one monitor and play the video on the other. I think that's very instructive potentially. So this game will be submitted to the chessworld.net video database as well with the annotated PGN. Pardon me. So this key game that I want to look at this morning is in round 13. Vishy Anand was doing extremely well in the tournament and was playing Sergey Karjakin, who was actually one of his closest rivals now in terms of tournament points. He really had to secure a draw, and he was playing with the black pieces. So was this to be an unlucky number 13, round 13? Although number 13 is also Kasparov's favourite number. Kasparov was the 13th world champion, so maybe it's lucky or unlucky for some. So d4 from Sergey, and Vishy replied solidly with d5 after c4, e6. So a very stable opening response from Vishy so far. Knight f3, knight f6. And now usually white plays things like knight c3, that's the most popular move in this position. Or g3, Catalan style. Or bishop g5, getting the bishop out, pinning the knight. But actually we have the more modest move e3, which is also, it's like the fourth most popular in my live book. It closes in the bishop for a moment, but the bishop can now think about fianchettoing here. We see bishop e7 from Vishy, and now white does play b3, black castles, bishop b2. So quite a modest system from white. Vishy reacts now with c5, so putting pressure on that d4 pawn. White now plays a very rarely used method. Usually knight c3 is played here, or knight bd2. White actually played c takes d5. So what is Sergey up to with the white pieces? Well, if e takes d5, I think white can enjoy a dark square grip in this position. White's got a small advantage, perhaps you could argue. As bishop e2, there's a dark square grip, and that's fine. But Vishy didn't play this, even though it might open up his bishop. He kept his pawns a little bit more solid by playing knight takes d5. So you'll see the pawn structure here is a little bit more solid without a potential weak d5 pawn. But now d takes c5, and we have actually what seems to be an invitation for a symmetrical pawn structure almost now. When in fact, more than almost, it seems bishop takes c5 would actually be a symmetrical pawn structure. And given the tournament situation, this kind of structure is ideal for playing for a draw. The engines give white as a slight advantage, though. I think this will be a problem bishop. So for example, bishop c4, b6. But here, you know, it's about equal. There doesn't seem to be a big deal in terms of any major concerns here for black. With the symmetrical pawn structure, you think this is okay. Vishy actually played, well, maybe you could consider this a slight risk. He played knight d7. So it's nice to be able to preserve options like bishop f6 on this diagonal, and to be able to take this pawn with the knight, for example. But a little surprise move is thrown in here from white. White actually played c6, so this actually ruins the perfect symmetry of the pawns, giving back the pawn here. And also this c file is potentially quite useful for white to torture the pawn, you'd think. Let's see what happened. Knight bd2. Now Vishy plays a5, which the engines actually like for black to play aggressively with this isolated pawn to try and dissolve it, and maybe give white some structural concerns. e4. Now the knight goes back to f6, and we see queen c2, not developing the bishop yet. I think bishop e2 was also playable. I'm not sure a4 is such a big deal in this position, so this was also playable with a slight plus for white. But anyway, after knight f6, queen c2 was played, and it didn't really seem as though white's actually threatening queen takes c6 to get his pawn back. And so Vishy just continued with a4, because you'd think it's a little bit risky perhaps intuitively, and yet here at move 13 in round 13 we see actually Sergey actually playing queen takes c6, and I think this was much of a surprise. This was quite a surprise to Vishy, because there were various ways of black to try and exploit the queen for tempo gain here, and perhaps the most critical, which wasn't played in the game, queen a5 was played, but perhaps the most critical, it seems, is rook a5. And the idea is potentially knight c5 to close up the queen, and then bishop b7 to trap it, taking away the b5 square. And it's difficult to suggest how white cannot get a disadvantage if black plays super accurately. So for example here, queen c2, trying to safely retreat the queen back, bishop b7, and the worst is not over. If white now tries to routinely castle with bishop e2, black in this position, believe it or not, has good tactical opportunity to play a takes, rook takes, bishop takes, leaving a loose piece, and our beautiful tactic, knight takes e4, targeting that loose piece after knight takes, bishop takes, queen a5 check, with advantage to black. So this would have been a fantastic continuation. It's easy for engines to pick these things up, but rook a5 apparently is one of the most accurate technical moves here, and it's difficult actually to see how white avoids a significant disadvantage. Maybe queen c1 is securer, but it looks fundamentally passive, but I'm not sure there's any major issue now in that variation. But black would have been happy. Here, in fact, it still seems knight takes e4 might be on the cards. Well, bishop takes e4, we just win this centre pawn. And if anyone's better here, it's black. If anyone's slightly better now, it's black. This is a nice position for black, but it's not a symmetrical pawn structure. But this pawn is going to be a target on the b file, essentially. So okay, so this is a kind of a cheeky little move, queen takes c6. There are various ways of replying, but rook a5 seems to be one of the more accurate. Rook a7 is also interesting as well. And Vishy mentioned, I think, some of these possibilities in the post-game analysis. But instead now queen a5 was played, and this represents a pawn sacrifice actually. It's protecting the rook, but white now can actually just go a pawn up after queen takes a4. But the idea for black is to have enough counterplay down the a file on the a pawn, so that should be in balance still. So after taking knight c5, so for the moment in this position white is 2 pawns up, bishop b5, and now this pawn actually can't be taken. This is a naughty move for bishop c6. If knight takes e4, knight takes, or is it? Pardon me. No, apparently bishop c6 doesn't quite do much here. You might think initially it does something, but black has bishop b4 check, and now wherever the king goes, there's bishop a6 check. And here, actually, black has a fantastic resource to avoid any disadvantage here with knight c3, believe it or not. So if taking here, check, and a draw could be forced here, and that would be ideal for Vishy. So okay, after bishop b5, it does seem as though knight f takes e4 is almost playable, but white doesn't have to play bishop c6 here. White could just castle with a small advantage. He's holding on to the pawn on a4, and okay, it's an action where they're double, but white's bishops actually look quite good here in this position. I think white does have a nagging edge here. So anyway, after bishop b5, in fact Vishy took on a4, so he's one pawn down, but with pressure on the a file. The bishop goes to d4, and it's here after the game that Vishy expressed, you can see the point now that white's got something going on here after bishop d4. This isn't so easy to recoup the pawn, perhaps. So we see bishop d7, bishop takes, knight takes, and now king e2. The king is better off in the center. The rooks are immediately connected, and the king could be useful in the center as long as there's no lethal checks or anything. And in this scenario, it doesn't seem as though there's a major problem. White now has a very comfortable plan after knight ac5. White plays rook hc1. White can now think about doubling rooks, which would not only help protect a2 a little bit, but coming down the c file is very desirable. Rook a4, rook c2, rook f a8, and now counter-attacking with rook ac1. And here white's got a small nagging advantage. If Vishy moves the knight back, this is asking for a little bit of trouble actually. Rook c8 check might be quite good, in fact. Rook takes, and if going into this pin, this is okay for white, apparently. Something like this, giving back the pawn. White slightly better here. This is an annoying pin, but okay, it might not be such a big deal though. Might still be just about okay. It's a little bit uncomfortable for black, but perhaps not such a big deal. So let's go back. So after rook ac1, knight a6 wasn't chosen. In fact, Vishy simplifies basically, but with an interesting dynamic of two pieces for the rook. He plays rook takes a2. Now he does make the pawn structure again symmetrical here, but two pieces for the rook is usually a concern. Rook takes c5, bishop takes, and the tactic rook c8. After bishop a3, rook takes c1, bishop takes c1. So two minor pieces for the rook there after those transactions, after rook takes c5. Just to show you that again. So this was taken. If rook takes c5 here, then actually this would be a better version. Taking here is a better version, much better actually, because actually black has now two rooks against the three minor pieces. Black's doing very well here. So white has to take, he doesn't want to lose the exchange there. Bishop takes c5, so he goes into that pin, but then there's this resource bishop a3. So that's how white gets two pieces for one rook. So Vishy needs a draw here. After king e3, he plays what seems to be a slightly committal move, f6, but he wants to get a pawn to e5 to rule out white's d4 square for a piece. Now here, white did use the d4 square for a moment. e5, knight e2. It's a difficult position for white to try and win. The engines give white as about half a pawn advantage, theoretically, or Houdini 4 at a big depth, towards half a pawn advantage only. In fact, 0.46, 0.44, a bit less. So the win is by no means straightforward if there is a win from this technical advantage. I think it's rather drawish myself. So here Vishy actually commits to playing h5, and you might be a bit concerned about a loose pawn on h5. So what's the idea? Well, okay, the move h3 was played, king f7. Black can potentially think about g5 and h4 to try and get a grip on this side of the board, and these pawns on dark squares would restrict the bishop and the knights coming in perhaps to f5. Now here, if this knight tries to get to f5, let's just show this as an example, knight g3. This might be okay just to play h4. So after knight f5, it's not so simple. Rook c2 in fact, and it's not so simple. And black actually would be better if the bishop moves here, check, and we can win the bishop. So yeah, there's some big problems with coordination here and not dropping off a piece to this rook. The rook's quite well placed on the second rank at the moment, so something like knight g3 doesn't seem that good. White played knight c3, kicking the rook, rook c2, knight e2, and we're going to go into a long protracted phase soon. This is a 90 move game. Rook a2, and now white does commit to h4. g6 was played. g3, and now king e6. Now here, from mentioned perspective, is actually even less than 0.40. Now we're talking 0.38 to white. It doesn't look like there's any big deal at all for white here. White plays f3, king f7. So Vishy's content with a draw. It looks a little bit of a concern that this knight's going to d5 all the time, but the rook sticks around, hitting the bishop, forcing the knight back. So knight b1, and Sergey's not giving an easy draw here. Knight b3, he's playing on. Knight b to c3, rook a1, bishop b2. So we have a slight difference now in scenario. Rook f1, tying the king down to f3. Knight d5. What is white up to? Well, potentially it seems here there might be concern with f4 to target f6 on this diagonal. But this is parried in advance with a very strong looking move. In fact, there might be other moves as well as what was played. Rook d1 might be okay here. If f4, then maybe just knight c5 with the idea of rook d3 check. It's not so easy. This e pawn would be loose, so if taking here, this is actually better for black. It's just not an easy position, and then we can take this. It could be a disaster for white if white's reckless. But Vishy plays another good move here against this potential idea of f4. He plays actually knight a5, threatening knight c4 check to win the bishop. So white now stops that with knight b6, and then we get an exchange here after rook b1, which seems good, skewing bishop c3. Now, if Vishy doesn't take on b6, if he plays knight c6, then white might have made some sort of progress after knight c4, or with the idea again of f4, possibly. So say king e6, f4. Yeah, this looks a little bit more scary than before, as though black's pieces are quite well coordinated against e5. And you know, if you can create a weakness here on e5, then also there'll be a weakness on g5, which might be exploitable one day. But anyway, no. After bishop c3, we see not knight c6, but actually just taking off on b6. So simplifying down further. So two pieces against the rook, a classic scenario. Rook b3 check, bishop c3. Now Vishy plays g5 here, so it's quite aggressive with his pawns. they're holding down white's pieces and discouraging f4. In fact, if f4 was a concern here, it's been squashed with g5. In this position, if f4 now, then black can just take with not the g pawn. Actually, better is to take with this pawn, and so we can play g takes h4. And this would be dangerous. So it does discourage white from playing f4 here. White actually played, and perhaps this is quite committal, white played h takes g5, which gives black potential for playing h4 one day for an outside pass pawn. If white wanted to sit on the pawn structure with king d2, it's difficult to suggest what white's winning plan is here. This is tricky, because if hg to try and win e5, there's always f3 dropping off. So the rook is continually exerting pressure on white's pawns in many of these variations. So let's go back. After g5, hg is played, fg. Bishop being pinned is unpinned, now threatening bishop takes e5. We see rook b5 defending that for a moment. Now white commits on move 48 to an important structural decision, g4, and looks to be fixing black's pawns, but it gives black an outside pass pawn now, but this needs to be precisely calculated. Now what would be the alternative to h4? Well, I don't think it's that pleasant. After hg, fg, I think white is actually winning this position. The advantage has shot up to 1.75 for white, and so you might wonder why. Let's have a quick look. Rook c5, king e3, king e6. White can play now bishop d2, safeguarding the bishop, and now reroute the knight to attack both pawns, and this is going to start to be quite painful here in this position. Attacking g5, and it's starting to be hopeless. I think, for example, here bishop c3. Now bishop takes e5 check is a good way to get a winning king and pawn ending. So no, Vishy played the exact move here that was needed. He played h4, very well calculated, because there still seems to be an issue of g5 being a target. It's on a dark square, so the knight and bishop can theoretically coordinate to attack this pawn. Knight g1, rook c5, bishop d2 targeting, pawn in progress. Rook c2 though, pinning the bishop, king e2, rook a2, knight h3 targeting, still in progress. So both pieces are on it, but now an astonishing move played by Vishy, king g6. This is equal now. There's a big snag for white here. If knight takes g5, white's okay, taking this pawn, it looks good, but rook takes d2, and this position here is actually a draw, believe it or not. Black is not obliged at all to lose his pawn or to risk anything with h4. h4 is an immediate loss. King f2, king f4, and white wins here with king g1. And the reason for this is if king takes f3, then g5, and this pawn is queening, and this pawn is going nowhere. So h4 to h3 will be absolutely losing, but black in this position has either king f6 or king h6 waiting around, and there seems to be nothing white can do here for an advantage, because now in this position, if for example f4, then circumstances have changed radically for h3 to be now a drawing resource, believe it or not. for example, taking king f3, h2, and here I think we can even just take here, and it's just drawn. Or even better, lure the king away, even more accurate, even further. And let's take here. Well, this is drawn position. Okay, so yeah, it seems as though knight takes g5 is not working for white because of rook takes d2. Let's just convince ourselves again. So king e3, any way to move king, well, the two waiting moves here work. Funny enough, king g6 doesn't work. King g6 doesn't work. Precision in chess endgames. f4 actually wins here for white. If takes, this is actually lost for black. If h3, king g3, and this is totally lost for black. But you might wonder, okay, so king f6 was hanging around e5, but also king h6 works. And if f4, h3 here, you might think this is curious, isn't it? Well, if takes here, we queen the pawn. And if the king goes over here, then we take here. We've got these two pawns now. If e5, king g5, this pawn's not going anywhere. And the king can't take that one because of h2. So this is drawn as well. White actually has to play king f2, king f7. And white has to play, I think quite accurately, this loses to king e6. White would have to play g5. And we reach a position with both pawns stopping each other here quite cutely. That black cannot take this one because of this one. And we have the same sort of mirror position over here with these two pawns, that white cannot go for this one without this one queening. And so we get this position, king e7, king f3, king e6, king f2, draw, believe it or not. Fantastic stuff in king and pawn endings. So there's actually two key moves which actually draw here staggeringly in these lines. So king f6 or king h6, whilst king g6 loses. Another test of king h6, just for those really interested in this. King f2, king g6. If the king tries to go over here, does that matter? Well, no. King sticks around, doesn't go to f4. I think this is now winning for white. If the king goes to f4, that turns into an immediate win for white, believe it or not, with king h2. How painful an inaccuracy. If taking, we queen the pawn. If king g5, king h3, and zugzwang, now unpleasant. So yeah, but with accuracy, black here plays king f6 or king h6, or even in this position king g6 now works. So there's intricacies to be explored here, and this is crucial for black to be able to draw in this stuff, in these variations. So anyway, so here instead of knight takes g5, king d3, so we're at move 53, and now we get a lot of repetitive patterns emerging. So it was a 90 move game, and I'm just going to show you sort of the moves without too much commenting now, because this is already a long video. I've tortured you enough with the intricacies of that knight takes g5. We get this, so we're at move 75, and the two pieces just cannot coordinate with the outside pass pawn now. Once this has been secured as a major asset, not to be destroyed early on, it's now the engine's just crying out 0.00 for all the moves. And the players played on though. I don't know, Sergey was being slightly sadistic or determined, or both, or just annoyed with himself or something. But now here the moment was taken after bishop e1, a crucial moment at move 88, where Vishy threw in h3 check. So an exciting moment to wake up here. So what happens here if king takes h3? This wasn't played. Well, black would actually be better with rook e2, it seems. Knight d3, rook e3. Double attack on 2 minor pieces, forcing white to play knight takes e5. After rook takes e1. So actually black's slightly better here, technically. So anyway, after h3, this king takes h3 wasn't played. In fact, an inferior technical move from an engine perspective, king f1. And now after h2, it's black that technically has the advantage of 0.63, believe it or not, at move 89. Black is now threatening rook takes f2 and queening the pawn. So Sergey has to parry that with something. Knight h1 is virtually the only move. If king g2 here, black is much better with rook e2, believe it or not. If the bishop moves, we just take on f2, winning. If taking here, we just take on e1, being the exchange up. So white is forced into precision after knight h1 on move 90, with black slightly better. Vishy plays rook b1. We see king e2. White is just passive now. He's just tied up. The 2 minor pieces have been destroyed in their use. They're not going to coordinate to anything naughty now in their current state with this dangerous h pawn. So after king e2, though, I think a draw offer was made or something, but they agreed a draw here. A draw was made here. Black can't really easily play for a win, although it seems, I think it was suggested to get the king round. Now let's just examine this at move 91 just from a theoretical perspective. But you just needed a draw to mathematically be clear to challenge Magnus Carlsen later on this year. 2014. But let's try and get the king in if Sergey Karjakin could have been beaten from this position. Okay, let's get the king over here. Is it absolutely critical? Put the king on here. So it's white waiting around for black to be doing something. There's a slight wall here for black. How does it actually make progress with this bishop? Eyeing c3. If king d4, what is this actually threatening? Well, check and then king e3, but now the king can be kicked with knight f5 check or bishop f2 check, but knight f5 check is an example, and the knight just going back. So there's a virtual wall, force field, around white's position. White's just about holding this, but black is the one with the advantage. 0.68, the engine cries. But anyway, so a great draw for Vishy. And I hope you got something out of that. It was clinical precision, I think, calculation to guarantee a draw when black had played h4. And some people argue, well, g4 was a mistake, but it's so easy to miscalculate those king and pawn endings. It's like a whole new mode of finesses and zugzwangs. As soon as, you know, in this endgame, and it looks as though white materialistically is winning g5, but it's just not the case. That's enough in those resulting endgames. So after g4, h4, that had really stamped the draw. Precise calculation though from Vishy to make sure that this is drawing. But he hasn't really got a choice. On hg, he would just be facing a loss. It'd be a totally different game result, I'd expect. So fantastic achievement there, drawing with Sergey Karjakin, who was a very determined and dangerous opponent, who actually the next day ground down the number 2 in the world with the black pieces. Sergey Karjakin beat Levon Aronian the next round. So this is a very, very dangerous opponent that Vishy needed to draw with the black pieces, and did so in fine style. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.